This morning we have Kathryn Tang, the engineering operations lead at Shopify, here to chat with us about risk in business. So welcome her, please.
All right, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to the talk. I feel like this will be an interesting discussion. We'll have some time for questions at the end. But first, we'll start with a little story. So this dates back to November 24th, 2021. And this is an important date because I work at Shopify, and in commerce, Black Friday is the biggest event of the year. And Black Friday was on November 26th, 2021. And so this was 2 days before Black Friday. We knew that there was a Ruby vulnerability. There was a patch pushed out 2 days before. And at this point, our systems are scaled up. Everyone's ready to sell. We are already seeing elevated traffic. We're already seeing a lot of major flash sales. And our biggest sale of the year is still coming in like 2 days. And this is really the start of the holiday season. So we're thinking, what do we do? We have very limited time. Pushing out a change right now adds a bit of risk for sure. But we actually were able to handle it pretty smoothly. And we pushed out the Ruby update to all our applications, to all our machines, and we didn't cause any downtime during this to our merchant sales, and it went very smoothly. And the reason for that was we were actually very well prepared and very well poised to handle a change like that. And we were well positioned because of some of the systems that we had put in place and some of the mechanisms that we used to manage risk leading up to this point. And so that's why I think these methods are worth sharing today. Okay, so a bit about me. I run the engineering operations team in the Shopify infrastructure org. And what we do is we provide all the business support. We manage the business of infrastructure. And so that includes things like major partnerships, contracts, cloud costs, and financial operations, which has been a big topic in the last year or two. We also run major cross-functional programs like preparing for Black Friday. So that's definitely a big deal. And the perspective I'll be speaking from today is that with a background in engineering and in business. I used to work as a wind engineering consultant looking at super tall buildings and stadiums and how they respond to hurricanes. So lots of risk, lots of uncertainty there. I used to work in helping business units scale and measuring what success looks like. But I'm also a competitive athlete. So I played disc golf, where risk mitigation is a big part of success in the game because you have to manage trade-offs. You have to manage when you're being aggressive versus when you have to hold back a little. And I think it's worth calling out that risk mitigation is really about optimization. In an ideal world, we know what the future looks like. We know what we're going to be faced with. We have infinite amount of money, amount of expertise, amount of time, but in reality, that's not the case. And so the question about risk mitigation is really, what do you do with limited time, limited people, limited resources, limited money? So what we're going to talk about today is going to give you a better sense of the Shopify scale we're operating in the environment and the constraints we're looking at. I'm going to share 4 questions that you can use for risk mitigation in your own organization, some examples, and we're going to learn from some other domains as well. And we'll have some time for questions. So first thing about the Shopify scale. So Shopify scale, I think what's important is both the for people to sell anywhere. So people like Kylie Cosmetics, like Gymshark, like Allbirds, they're all on Shopify selling globally. And we're a system where merchants have limited inventory, limited physical inventory. And so we have to think about latency. We have to think about, well, who out of the millions of buyers who are trying to get this product actually gets this product? So that's the commerce-shaped problem. But also we're just operating at a size where we have a global footprint, we are large, we have complex infrastructure systems, and we have thousands of developers, including hundreds of infrastructure developers. And what that means is that nobody knows every corner of the technology. And that's important because when you're managing risk, this is a constraint that you just have to deal with and navigate and you have to figure out how to best leverage the expertise that you have. Some numbers. We process 3 terabytes per minute of egress traffic. We're handling 76 million requests per minute, 16 gigs of logs, 437 million sent emails over Black Friday. Over the weekend of 4 days, it's $7.5 billion USD of global GMV at a peak of $3.5 million of GMV that our merchants are processing. And so that's the system that really has to stay up under this type of load. And so what are the 4 main type of questions? The first is to get a sense of what are the risks that you're dealing with. And this is where we're going for breadth and we're going for volume, not necessarily depth. And so what we're doing is we're giving everyone a chance to tell us what they know about the system. We're leveraging the expertise of our whole network of engineers to say, okay, for our infrastructure, what do you think could go wrong? Tell us about it. Maybe it's something with our edge routing network. Maybe it's something with our databases or our observability stack. Just tell us. And anybody can submit something, and even if it's just a hunch of like, I think that part is iffy, somebody should look into it, we accept answers like that too, because all we're going is for quantity. So we gather all those things. The next question is, we have lots of ideas. So from the first exercise, we probably have 100 more risks. We can't solve them all, and it looks really daunting. And so the question is, what do you do when you have this list? Because you have, again, limited time, limited money, limited expertise. And so what we're doing is, okay, this becomes an optimization problem. How do we prioritize? So then the first thing we do is we say, okay, everyone, now that the ideas are in, let's vote on them. What would you vote for as either the most important or most urgent, or the thing that we really need to look into? Maybe it's a financial risk. That counts as well. And people can use their own criteria. That's fine, because I think there's different perspectives we can learn from in terms of what type of risk is important. So then in our what could go wrong exercise, now we have a ordered list of what risks have the top votes. Then we say, let's gather a bunch of technical experts, engineering leaders in a room, and let's discuss them. Let's go through them, chop down from the highest voted items. Let's just discuss. What are the implications? What is our technology? Do we have a workaround? Do we have time to build a backup? Is this something that we have to live with? And what we do then is when we said, okay, well, is this really a risk? How big of a deal is it? Can we assign an action item to it? And if so, who might be the right person to take action? So it's kind of a systematic way of saying, okay, let's turn these ideas into an action plan. And it seems to work really well. And sometimes really the action is, there's nothing we can do. One thing worth calling out is we're not trying to solve everything. So similar to the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, a lot of the times 80% of the value that you gain is actually from 20% of the time spent. And at some point you start to see diminishing returns. And that's something that we're very aware of, because one of the things that we care a lot about is we don't want to burn out our engineers. Because if you try to get everyone to tackle every problem and solve everything, they're going to be so burnt out by the time Black Friday hits that if an incident comes up, they're not going to be able to respond properly, and that is actually the worst thing you could do. You want them well rested for in case something comes up. And so this is why we try to pick the most important things, tackle that, get the big rocks, and really be in a good mental state to respond to whatever comes up. Back to the Ruby vulnerability. In 2021, several months before Black Friday, we actually anticipated something like this during our what could go wrong exercise. Somebody actually raised it as an idea of like, what if something happens externally that we don't have any control over? How do we do it? It's something that we're going to have to respond to right away. We can't control the timing. We can't control what it is. And that's actually exactly what happened. At the time, we said, there's nothing we can do. Let's just watch out for it. Let's just be in a good state to respond. And luckily, because we communicated with our stakeholders that this is something that might happen. We had good buy-in, we were able to mobilize quickly, we responded calmly, and we were able to push out these changes. So I think it just shows that some of these systems really do help and do work. Okay, question number 3 out of the 4 big questions is figuring out who makes the call. One thing I've learned over the years is that it's not just important what the right decision is, but whose decision is it? Because everyone will have a different opinion, and when you're dealing with constraints, there is no perfect solution, because sometimes the perfect solution takes years, decades, or takes like millions of dollars to implement, so it's not always feasible. But it's important who makes the call. What you want to do when you have a network of experts is figure out, well, what team is closest to the solution? What person has the most expertise on this? And then what you do is, if you can find that person, then they can make a call on really the decision at hand. And the other thing I've learned about finding the right decision maker is it's also about speed. Because you have limited time, speed is actually really important. And how much time and effort do you sink into making a decision before you make a decision? This is something where I really like the way Shopify does it, and it's about, okay, finding out who has the most risk and reward associated to a decision. Because often, that's the best person to champion a project. That's the best person to make a call, because they have a personal interest in this, and it's aligned with the company. And so what you do is, if you're able to find that person, then you can empower them to make a decision and essentially have a decentralized decision-making process. You can say, okay, you're the champion. Your job is to make sure to gather input, consult other people with expertise. Think about all sorts of considerations, from technological, financial, operational, all sorts of other things, reputational. And then with all those inputs, think through it, make a call. And if there's a lot of uncertainty around it, detail what are the pros and cons and thought process around making that call. And what happens is this allows you to move forward. You don't have to satisfy everyone, because when you make a call, there's always going to be someone who disagrees with you. That's fine. It is still better to make a decision and move forward than to just wait until everyone has consensus on the subject. And what happens at scale is that because we can make decisions so much faster, we can implement solutions a lot faster, and you can iterate really quickly. You get more iteration cycles. And even if you need to pivot from time to time, overall, you end up delivering a lot more product than you would if you waited for consensus on every decision. We also have bigger decisions that are beyond just a team and beyond just Black Friday. So sometimes we have single points of failure. And sometimes these are major technology investments over multiple years that are made by executive teams, and that's fine. Where this surfaces in our what could go wrong exercises is sometimes it's just worth calling out. Hey, exec this person, be informed that this is a single point of failure. It is due to our technology decision. We still think this is the right decision, but you need to be aware that this is a potential failure point, that we can only do so much to mitigate this. And if something happens, let's just be ready to act. So it's really important to just keep the right stakeholders informed about this, and that's all you can do. The fourth question is, how do you communicate? And so one of the major things we communicate is, again, to execs. At the end of our what could go wrong exercise, we will summarize really the key findings from that for an audience that in a format that's consumable for them. So we'll say, overall sentiment, how are you feeling about the state of our systems? How are you feeling about the risks? Maybe you're feeling pretty good because you've done more scale testing this year than ever before. So you know a lot more than previously. But maybe there's some unknown unknowns that you're still feeling iffy about. And that could be your TLDR. That could be, I'm generally feeling good, but there might be some uncertainties that nobody knows. You want to call out your key results or key risks. Okay, generally feeling good. These are 5 big potential failure points. You also want to call out your single points of failure. Okay, and this is the major technology decision that you have to think about. So then if next year somebody looks at the risk, they can say, oh yeah, our decisions in the past have led to this. Do we want to do anything different next year? And on top of the summary, you'll also want to just share a link so that people can find out the details of your discussion if it's relevant to them. Okay, so now I'll talk more general about how we can learn from other domains, because I think the structure is good, but I think the thought process behind some of the structure is also really important. So the first thing is poker. So imagine you're playing a game of poker and how you felt, right? If you make a bet and you win that bet, you think, wow, I did a great job. I made the best call. It was great to go all in. Sometimes you made a bad bet and you got lucky, right? But we never tell ourselves that. We want to feel great. But if you lose a bet, if you make a bet and your hand is not the strongest, it's very tempting to say, well, that was really unlucky. If only this happened, I would have won. And that's the type of attribution bias that I think is very common across industries, practices, games, work. And so it's something to be aware of. But really, poker is interesting because it's a game of chance. When you're making your bet, you don't have all the information. You don't know what the next card is going to turn up. So you have to make a decision based on probability. And while, one round might land you really anywhere, if you play enough rounds of poker, then your expected result actually converges on your actual result converges on your expectation. A large number dictates that if you roll the dice enough times, the average amount of the dice will be exactly what you expect. And so that's something you have to think about in risk mitigation when you think about over a long period of time, because risk mitigation is really the same thing in that when you're making a decision, you can't see into the future. You don't know what will happen. All you can do is make the best quality decision at the time with the information that you have, and you can't plan for the results. And sometimes you'll make the perfect decision that will yield a bad result, or you'll make a really terrible decision and get really lucky. As an organization, if you want good results on average, you do not want to reward lucky outcomes that came from bad decisions. You also do not want to penalize bad outcomes that came from good decisions, because it'll prevent people from making good decisions in the past. But if you can separate those two from quality of the decision versus the quality of the results, then generally you can build more accountability. Generally you can build a culture of more calmness when something happens. People just don't panic and say, wow, I was terrible. But instead they can think about, well, what are the steps that led here? How can I do better? Knowing that it's not always my fault. The other example that we can learn from is wind engineering. So I used to work as a wind engineering consultant. We used to look at stadiums, bridges, tall buildings, and how they responded to hurricane loads, how they ensured that they were safe under those loads. And it's a really complicated domain, which is super interesting, lots of probability. You have to look at the influence of the wind climate. You have to look at the influence of the terrain, of the aerodynamics around the building structural properties, because it has its own resonant frequencies. And you have to look at building code. And there's really 3 groups of techniques that we can borrow from that industry into risk mitigation in general. The first is using a probabilistic approach to risk mitigation. Around probability, you do not know in any given city, say New York, Atlanta, somewhere else, if a hurricane is going to hit in a particular year and what strength and all that. But what you can do is you can run a Monte Carlo simulation, and you can purchase reports saying, over a 50-year period, there is a 95% chance that you're going to get a hurricane up to this speed in this particular location. Or over a 100-year period, you're going to have a 50% chance of a hurricane up to that. And so you can use some methods to kind of design for that load based on chance. You can do the same thing with wind speeds to say that, in New York, over a 50-year period, you have a 95% chance of seeing northeasterly winds of 90 miles per hour or higher, or 120 miles. So let's design for that. you have systems that we use in wind engineering that really help. The first is you have a safety factor. So you already have your probabilistic basis, and you need some protection on top of that. You don't want to design for the 100 percentile because that's economically prohibitive. But if you design for 95 percentile with a safety factor of maybe 1.5, then that's a lot more predictable, and you can make sure your money is well spent. The other system is safety categories and severity categories. So depending on the use case, you might design something to a higher standard. So often we have residential buildings, just general, normal, like hotel building, office building, we'll design for a 50-year wind load. Like, what is the probability of something happening within 50 years? For something a bit more critical, like maybe a rec center, a library, community center, shelter, you might design for 100-year wind loads. Something more temporary, like scaffolding for a building that's in construction, maybe 20-year. And for something that's super critical, you can design bridges for 10,000-year wind events to make sure that they're really designed with a lot more durability in mind. And I think that practice applies to infrastructure and risk mitigation in general. For your critical pieces, you want to design it for a higher standard. And for things that are temporary, design it to a lower standard because you know the impact is a lot less severe. The third system we learned from wind engineering is really around due diligence. There's this thing around tort law where, how do you know you've done your due diligence in issuing a report to your client and designing their building? And it's really around, based on what is expected of you as a structural engineer, have you taken reasonable measures to anticipate potential failure modes, to mitigate them? Have you anticipated the severity of these failure modes and really designed workarounds or safety plans around that? Now, sometimes you have done all of your due diligence and everything that you are expected to do, but something still fails. Like maybe you expected a 100-mile-per-hour wind, but you got 200 miles per hour. You can't anticipate all of that. In that event, it's not necessarily your fault. But what really helps is that measuring somebody on taking the right steps to protect the public, to protect your users, it really helps in establishing a culture of accountability. So that overall, you're making high quality decisions. You're acting as professionals in really designing your solution for not just the way you want it to work, but the way it might not ideally work. So that really helps. And it gives you peace of mind that it's not just about the result, it's about really the practice and the process. Okay, one last question I'll leave you with. And this is, if you look back after Black Friday, after a major event, after an incident, can you defend your decisions? So if something does happen, if there is downtime, ideally not, and one of your customers asks you, what did you do? Can you say, well, hey, I assessed this risk, I thought it was low probability, I did everything I can, I implemented these fail safes, there's still something that happened. If you're able to show proof, to show that you've taken the steps, that you've really acted in a professional manner, then that's generally good, I think, discussion, because we cannot protect against 100% of the cases. But I feel like between these 4 questions that you could go through to identify what could go wrong, between the examples that we learn from, and between things that we can learn from poker, from wind engineering, I think that gives us a good basis for dealing with risk in a way that is optimal for running a business and helping a business succeed. And so that's the talk. If you have any questions, let me know. Question? I had a question about... I'll get you a mic.
So I had a question about the decision-making process, and you mentioned something super interesting, which was you want to make sure that the people who are making the decisions, at least people who are, primarily, are the people who are incentivized to, to make those decisions in a way that actually kind of helps them support it. I've kind of been in organizations, and this may just be a cultural thing, I don't actually know, but I've been in organizations where there's like a completely separate, customer service team. and then there's a separate engineering team. And the engineering team will make decisions based on the best knowledge that they have in terms of engineering and in terms of design and architecture and things like that. Whereas the customer support team is making decisions based on how can we reduce our, support load. In instances like that, what is typically have you seen instances like this in Shopify for one thing? And if you have faced something like this, what is typically how do you balance those two things?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really interesting specific case, and I think it also teaches something about the general case. I think in a specific case, every organization has some level of that, and some might be more severe than others. One thing that I found really helps is a pretty transparent conversation between different orgs around, well, what are the pain points you're dealing with? What are the pain points I'm dealing with? Because most of the time, everyone actually wants the best solution, they just have different facts. And they're optimizing for different incentives and what they're measured on. But I think the more there's conversation, not only between individual, like frontline facing contributors, but also leadership teams around, okay, well, is there actually a disconnect before what we're solving? Do we want to solve a balance? Do we actually want to tweak our goals in some sense to measure not only customer satisfaction, but also technology performance? I find that really helps. I feel like in the general case though, sometimes it's a matter of org structure and distance between your teams, because the closer you are with some team, the easier it is to align, because you're going through maybe a team lead, maybe a director, instead of like multiple VPs and SVPs. And so I feel like that is a part of the decision as well. I think every org structure has its pros and cons and trade-offs, and I think it's not expected to be perfect for every scenario all of the time, but if there's constantly a pain point where their customer success team is setting expectations completely different than what you're able to deliver, then I think that's worth the conversation. Maybe not about org structure, but at least about, what are you measured on? Yeah.
You were talking about risk mitigation in a sense of operational and financial. Do you start your risk mitigation process based on observability, or do you already have like a set template in those two aspects that you just start basing what qualifies as a risk and how to mitigate it?
Yeah, good question. I think we have several mechanisms in place. I mean, what I'm talking about is, the specific activity that we do to prepare for Black Friday. And that's an annual event that spans really several months when you look at Black Friday readiness. But there's also just evergreen activities throughout the year that really help. So you have your constant monitoring systems, looking at uptime, looking at latency, looking at traffic, looking at all sorts of things. We also have scale tests throughout the year where you will scale your systems up to an event, run a simulated load through it, see what fails, see what works, and fix up certain things. And so for that type of thing, we don't wait till Black Friday. And then there's also, if there's an incident, how do you figure out what actions need to be taken, what things need to be changed? And so I think it's a combination of all those activities that really help us prepare, because it's not just, what could go wrong exercise for BFCM alone is not enough to mitigate risk, but it's a nice time of the year where we all agree that let's take a step back, let's think more holistically, and not just about what data points we actually have available, but let's actually leverage some of the qualitative insight that our experts have around our systems and use that as a starting point to say, what do we need to take, what do we need to start measuring, and what do we need to change and prioritize? There's a question back there.
My question is somewhat related to both of those questions and your answers, but the starting point that I'm coming from is as an individual contributor or like a first line manager. If you want to change the culture gently and but effectively, and because at the VP level they are not having these conversations and it's not transparent, And what are some ideas for establishing that transparency? Like, is it confluence? And I got an idea from his question, which is you could start asking the question, what are you measuring, and have that, start as the transparent talking point. But then, what are some ideas for establishing that transparency when you're not coming at the VP level? You're basically going to change the culture from a lower level. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That can be easy or difficult depending on your position and depending on, I think, the background and perspective of the person you're trying to influence. What I find is that if you look at what they're measured on, if you look at their full roster of priorities, often there's a reason behind certain actions, because sometimes the direction of your investments is not optimizing the technical solution. Sometimes it's optimizing the business outcomes, financial outcomes, and sometimes that's legitimate, right? But I think the key is to figure out, well, what is it that the VP actually cares about? What are the reasons behind some of their decisions? What is their pain point? And if you can propose any culture changes or propose exploration in the direction that they care about, often that's a good way to start. And even if it's like, okay, well, your pain point is we don't have visibility here. Can I just start with a prototype or an experiment to give you better visibility in this particular thing? And let's use that to identify some action items. And then maybe it's these action items will help us provide more robust systems here, providing lower downtime, which actually is better for our customer relationship or their lifetime value or something else. Then that might be a good case. Because I think it's not convincing if we start from the point of like, well, I think this is good because it's good. Like there just has to be some justification that ties to the decision maker's interests.
Following that, you mentioned that there's situations where they will look at a particular decision, if that's already part of the culture, of course, that they look at this is the decision we made and how we arrived at that and the outcome, and then evaluating, So if that's not already part of the normal culture or procedures, what form does that take if that's not already, like, how would you start that? Would it be like recording on a Confluence page for a particular area? I mean, how would you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's maybe a couple of things that I would think about, and it's not a perfect answer, I assure you. One thing is focus on the area that you control. Like the more you can demonstrate success of a methodology or a way of thinking in a specific area, the more that it can expand and snowball. Because it's a lot easier to start small and then grow rather than start at a higher level. It's just really difficult because then you're taking on a larger risk, larger investment. And the second is, I think each organization and team and individual has their own mental models for making decisions and has their own biases and incentives. And sometimes it may not be possible to really change culture or the way people think, just depending on really who your leaders are. And so the good thing is, this is a free economy. We get to go to different places if we're looking for a different culture, a way of making decisions. And for some companies, that is a part of your really, your competition strategy for really great talent is, hey, we work this way culturally to get stuff done, to listen to people, and this actually is what attracts talent for people who want to work on interesting things and have a voice. And so, I mean, that's kind of a constraint of organizations as well, as sometimes it's not always possible to change culture. Well, here, then there? Or you're here first? Okay.
By the way, I loved the slide about building for hurricanes. I think that's actually like a really good worldview in a sense.
Thank you.
and it's a skill that I don't really have, and I would like to get that. So, are there any resources, things like books or articles or blog posts, for example, that I can use to sort of help kind of develop that skill?
For wind engineering specifically, I yeah, I mean, I think that there are case studies of notable buildings built up and what strategies have been used in those areas. Like Taipei 101, they have a massive tuned mass damper that sways when there's a hurricane. Like, it works really well. There's other buildings too. But I think overall, there's a lot of domains we can learn from. One thing I really liked is when I was going through my professional engineering licensure process in Canada, I had to read this law and ethics book. And I found the tort law section of the law book was actually really interesting, because it talks about, what is tort law? What are you liable to do? What is due diligence? And I think that's really interesting, because then it gives you kind of a mental model to work through some of these things, and how it comes into practice, I think, differs across really your application. Because for wind engineering, it might be a combination of Monte Carlo simulations, probability, and then like a safety factor, and then insurance. But for something else, it might be different. But I think there are places on the internet where you can find summaries of the law and ethics books, and I think it's great at outlining what a person should be responsible and how you should think about things. Yeah.
This is a great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
So speaking to just the company itself, Shopify, the voice or one of the slide decks was who is actually making decision. Where is the priority of that? Do you feel that the voice of the engineering team is heard more, or is it coming, or the voices emanate more from the executive level? Because if you think about it, the perspective from both sides of the fence are going to be different, but are the voices equally weighed out, or there's a bias one towards the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends on the level of decision. It depends on also the specialization of what you're trying to solve. What I find is that there's a difference between who makes the decision and who is consulted. I feel like we generally do a good job of getting the input and really hearing people out. I think when you're making a decision, if you think about it holistically, there's so many different factors of it, like financial, operational, logistical, timelines, reputational, and just, is there a path that actually gives us more information for us to iterate on? There's a lot of considerations. And what I find is, sometimes a decision is made by somebody higher up, and that's fine. And not everyone on the team agrees with it. Or I'm making a decision and my peers don't agree with it, which happened before. Like, it's very normal. And I think what's good is that you want to develop a culture of respect for your peers, and that they're trying their best. They may have different facts than you, but they're trying to do what's good for the company. And I respect it when somebody else makes a different decision and that I don't agree with, knowing that if along the way different facts surface, they will actually pivot. But I feel like with higher ups and execs as well, I feel like generally folks are receptive if you present new information. And you have to bring some information. You have to bring a reason to why you think something should be done a certain way. And then when they make a decision, I find I generally trust that it's in the best interest of the company based on the information that they have, and they're willing to pivot later on if they need to. And so it's no, we don't always agree. No, people don't feel like they're always aligned to a decision, but at least we generally trust that people are making decisions for the right reasons and they're flexible. So I think I'm okay with that.
You mentioned that you got your PE, so I'm just curious, do you find that getting your EIT and then your PE is useful in your current role or in the technology field in general?
Hello. Okay, this is working. So the question was around, was it worthwhile to get my professional engineering? So I study mechanical engineering, I worked in structural engineering, and I found, and I'm currently a non-practicing engineer because I'm working in a different field than I was licensed for. And so directly, I'm not using my license. However, I find some of the training, the thinking about risk, the law and ethics modules, I found they were helpful. And I actually still do the yearly, just like basic requirements, just as a reminder, because I find it's helpful for making good decisions in general. But it, I think, depends on your specific case around whether or not it's worth the effort.
Any more questions? I had one, actually. Would you find it useful to document and share risk documents around the risk appetite along various dimensions and various aspects of the company, or would that be like too onerous to keep up to date? Is it too dynamic to try to capture that sort of information so that decision makers can, across different orgs can see what others were thinking about?
Yeah, definitely very dynamic. I think risk appetite. Oh, do you want me to repeat the question? So the question from Alan was around, do we want to document risk appetite on different parts of the org, and if it's too, yeah. I do think it's very dynamic and it changes over time. I feel like what is helpful is documenting a framework around the general case, because I think your approach should be somewhat consistent over time, in that if it's a longer term investment, then I think you're going to be less able to pivot. So you probably have to tolerate less risk. You probably have to discover more information before you make a decision and you're locked into it. If it's a shorter term thing where you can pivot really quickly, sure, experiment, try something. If it fails, switch it. And I also think that our landscape and our competition landscape, our technology landscape is changing so quickly that we do need to be adaptable, and sometimes it's a matter of picking a direction that we think that there's going to be future investment in, or picking a direction where we're going to be allowed more flexibility to make a choice later on, because sometimes that's a decision. I don't know if that answered your question, but answer something.
Cool. If there are no more questions, then please thank Kathryn for speaking for us today. Thank you so much.